Welcome back to Bible 101, our year-long overview of the Holy Scriptures. We are now in the midpoint of our class. This is session 5, and we will be focusing on probably the least known or least well-known part of the Bible, known as the Apocrypha. We'll look at what that means and where it came from and what's in it and how we think about it. If you are joining us for the first time, I'll just do a little review of what we've been up to the last couple of months. In September, we looked at how the Bible was written. In October, the history in and behind the Bible. And then in November and December, we really looked at what's in the Hebrew Bible, starting with the Torah, the first 5 books, and then looking at the prophets and the writings. All of those classes are available where you're watching this on YouTube, and you're welcome to watch those videos anytime you'd like, and also to email me with questions. My email will be at the end of this lecture if you want to get in touch and ask deeper or further questions or clarify things that may be confusing. It's a lot of information in a pretty short time, not that short, but pretty short. And so I welcome your comments and thoughts and questions. And then after this month, starting in February, we will dive into the New Testament for the rest of the year and look at the Gospels and the letters of Paul and others. And then in June, we'll have a kind of summary class where we talk about how does the Bible, all the stuff that we've learned about, what we read every Sunday, what we learned in Sunday school and in Bible study, how does it actually come together to guide us in our life of faith? So today, this class will be offered live or has been offered live, depending on when you're watching this, on Thursday, January 16th at St. Philip's. If you want to join us in person, if you're seeing this before that, you're welcome to. There'll be cookies and coffee as well as conversation, and you're always welcome to join us for those and all of our other classes. So to start, what is the Apocrypha? So the word, which comes from medieval Latin, apocryphus means secret or non-canonical. What does canonical mean? Canonical means that which is according to the rule, which has been accepted. So we say something is canon when it's accepted as part of the official collection of whatever organization, in this case, the church. It comes from a Greek adjective, apokryphos, which means obscure, or from the verb apokryptein, which means to hide away. So something that is hidden or secret or obscure, and that's pretty much how the Apocrypha has been throughout the history of the Bible. So in our context, it's really about the books that were being included or not included in the Bible. So we talked in the history of the Bible that the Hebrew Bible was really officially kind of put together in the year 90 of the Common Era in Javne or Jamnia by a council of rabbis. The New Testament sort of evolved over the first few centuries of the church's life. And at some point, we'll probably do a class on the Gnostic Gospels, those later Christian writings that were considered too far out to include in the Bible. But by, let's say 300 of the Common Era, there was a pretty clear understanding of what was in the New Testament. But there were these other books that were a little harder to pin down. They were written in Greek mostly. Some of them may have been written in Aramaic or even Hebrew, but most likely Greek. Towards the end of the Hebrew Bible period and into the first century of the Common Era. And Christians throughout history have kind of debated what to do with these books, how to think of them, whether to include them or not. It was a point of great contention during the Protestant Reformation, whether they should be considered part of the official Bible or not. And in our study of them, we kind of reflect on, well, what does this say about how the Bible is actually put together, how it's formed? Kind of interesting to think about when it comes to these books, which are in the gray area, we might say, of biblical canonicity. So some key vocabulary words I've been throwing around. Apocrypha, we just learned, means something that is hidden or non-canonical. Canon or canonical, that which is officially included in by whoever the group is, in this case, the church. Deuterocanonical just means a second canon. So like the book of Deuteronomy means second law, the recovery of the law, the restatement of the law of Moses. Deuterocanonical means, okay, there's the first canon and now there's a second canon. These are like, not thrown out, but maybe they're in a second category, deuterocanonical. So sometimes you'll see on a Bible, the Bible with the Apocrypha / the deuterocanonical books. That's what they're talking about, these books that we're talking about in this class. The Vulgate was the first Latin translation of the Bible that was composed by St. Jerome at the behest of the Pope, so that these Greek and Hebrew writings could be put into Latin. The Septuagint, we talked about, is very important in this context. This was the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible and includes almost all of the books that we're going to talk about today. So the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, we would say, those books did not include all of these books, but the Greek version that was written later, translated later, was a translation of the Hebrew Bible and included some of these later books that were in Greek originally. And so the Septuagint is a slightly larger collection of books than, we might say, the Masoretic Hebrew text that we find in the Middle Ages. So if you're not hopelessly confused. So these are just some words just to remind ourselves of what they mean. So when we talk about the history of the people, the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, diaspora is an important word, and it really means the scattering. And so at various times in history, the Hebrews, the Jews, the Israelites were scattered. They were conquered, they were scattered, and spread all throughout the world. So the Assyrians and the Babylonians, one of their strategies for conquest was to take their conquered people and scatter them through, at least the leaders, scatter them throughout their empire so they couldn't band together and start a revolt. And this has a lot of impact on the history of Judaism, because these diaspora Jews are bumping into Persian ideas and Greek ideas and philosophy, and that comes back together into some of these writings, especially in the Apocrypha and then later in the New Testament. They were influenced by the cultures in which they found themselves. Hellenistic simply means the Greek-influenced culture that goes on into the Roman Empire. So we have Alexander the Great, the Macedonian prince who conquers a great deal of the ancient world, spreading Greek ideas and culture wherever he went. And so that is a huge part of this larger cultural context, is that Greek thought is really taking root all over the world and being spread by Alexander and then later the Roman Empire. Apocalyptic. So some of the writings that we read about in the Apocrypha and in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament are apocalyptic. We talked a little bit about what that means. It tends to be things that were hidden and are now uncovered. And so a lot of the symbolic writings like the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation are apocalyptic because they are using dramatic, almost like science fiction imagery to reveal something true about the world that we're living in and how God is actually working in the world. And so apocalyptic is a huge part of biblical writing. And then liturgical. Some of the things that we find in the Apocrypha and in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament were written to be used in worship. So liturgical means of worship. So liturgy, the work of the people, and that is what we do when we come together to worship, and we use some of these scriptures in our worship to this day. In Jewish synagogues and Christian churches, we are all using liturgical scriptures in liturgical settings also. So just some vocabulary. All right, just a little history behind the Apocrypha. So the earliest Christians quoted from the Greek versions of the Hebrew canon and the Apocrypha without making any distinction, because the Bible that the early Christians had was the Septuagint. It was the Greek translation. And so for early Christians, this was all part of the Hebrew Bible in Greek, called the Septuagint. That's the Bible that they had. That's what they quoted from. And so they really didn't separate out these books of the Apocrypha as being lesser or different in any way. They were just all part of the Bible that they knew. But by the 4th century, the churches in the eastern part of the Christian world, what we now call the Eastern Orthodox churches, in those days, the Greek-speaking churches, they began to see that there was a distinction between these sets of books, some that were in the original Hebrew Bible and some that had been added in the Greek translation of the Septuagint. But they really considered it all still scripture, still holy, still canonical, still part of the Bible. In 1672, the Orthodox churches are very late, explicitly designated some of these books as canonical. So just to remove any doubt, yes, these were, according to that synod. But in the West, most of them continued to be treated as canonical. There were some disputes until the Reformation, and we'll see what happened then. And Jerome himself, when he was translating the Latin version, the Vulgate, he designated some of them as apocryphal because he was noticing that there were differences in theology and tone and even in dating. And so begin to see that there's some distinctions being made by the different Christian groups as they looked at these books. So the big turning point is the Reformation. And the reason was that for Protestant thinkers, especially the more radical Protestants, who believed in what we call sola scriptura, scripture alone, the Bible was the only source of doctrine. And so it was essential that we have the right Bible. If we're going to have the right Bible, then we can have the right doctrine and we'll be on the right track. You know, it's different for Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and I would say even Anglican or Episcopalian Christians, because for us, tradition and reason are also part of the authority of the church. But for these radical Protestants, scripture alone was the authority of the church. And so they wanted to make sure that they had it right. So for instance, over the issue of purgatory, which Catholics at that time accepted and Protestants did not, part of the rationale for that came from an apocryphal book, Second Maccabees, which talks about offerings for the sins of the dead, so that they would gain grace. This was kind of the rationale, the proof text for this whole doctrine of Reformation. And so Protestants were like, well, we can't accept those apocryphal books because they have bad doctrine, and so they're not Bible for us. And so they basically tossed them out. So the Protestant view became, we don't despise these books, but we do not allow them divine authority on the same level as the rest of the Bible. This was also the view of the Church of England when it was kind of articulating its own theology in the 16th century. One of the main sort of compendiums of that was called the 39 Articles, kind of listing all the different beliefs of this new Church of England. And it explicitly talked about the Apocrypha, and it drew on what St. Jerome had been doing in the Vulgate. So that was their kind of source of authority. They said, and the other books, that's the apocryphal books, as St. Jerome says, the church reads for example of life and instruction of manners, but does not apply them to establish doctrine. That's the fine line that the Church of England drew. Yeah, it's okay to read them. In fact, it's good to read them. It's good for inspiration, for example, of how to live a life, but we're not going to base our doctrine on them. Again, maybe going back to that idea of purgatory. The Puritans, on the other hand, generally excluded the Apocrypha. And even to this day, if you go to a bookstore, many Bibles that are produced by more evangelical Protestant churches, like the New International Version and some others, do not include the Apocrypha, Whereas Anglican type Bibles like my, I don't know if you can see this, the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha, it says. I don't know if you can read that. So that's typically how that works. And in Roman Catholic Bibles would also typically include those things. We don't think about the Bible having a denomination, but different people that produce translations of the Bible are doing so with a theological bent. And so it's kind of interesting. Not all Bibles are printed or created the same. The Catholic view was definitively sort of decided at the Council of Trent in 1546. This was the council that was responding to the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestants had done all this kind of radical stuff. Catholic Church was like, whoa, we're losing all these people to these Protestant churches. And so the Council of Trent was like, how do we, in a way, it was closing the barn door, but it was like, how do we re-articulate what we believe and keep kind of a sense of clarity about what Catholic teaching is? And so they did that with respect to the Bible. And the church said it pronounces an anathema upon anyone who, quote, does not accept as sacred and canonical the aforesaid books in their entirety, which was most of that group of apocryphal books. Not all of them. There were a few that were denied that canonical status, and those, just for your curiosity, are the Prayer of Manasseh and First and Second Esdras. And not sure why. Not sure why those books were not included with the others. They're basically in the same kind of historical period and the same kind of writing. So it's just interesting that each church had to decide, what are we going to do? Are these books in? Are they out? How do we think about them? And each church at the time of the Reformation had to kind of come up with their own conclusion about that. Here's a chart. If you're really into this, you can see exactly which books were included by which church. So the Roman Catholics included everything except First and Second Esdras, the Prayer of Manasseh, Psalm 151. There was an additional psalm, as we'll see, that was added on. That was about David and Goliath. The Greek Orthodox basically accepted everything except Second Esdras and Fourth Maccabees. The Slavonic Russian Orthodox Church, that Bible had everything, I think, except Fourth Maccabees. The Latin Vulgate did not include them in their appendix. I think they included most of them, and then these others they included in an appendix. So Jerome's idea was basically, okay, we'll include most of them. The ones we're not sure about, we'll just put in an appendix. And so that was there. And then same with the Greek Bible, they added that Fourth Maccabees in the appendix. So it wasn't in the Bible part, but it was in the appendix, kind of like the Apocrypha as a separate section. And then the Anglicans had most of them in there as well. This says Protestant, but it really means Anglican. Many of the other Protestants did not include them. All right, so let's look at some context for the Apocrypha. When are these books being written? What are they responding to? So generally, those books are written after the fall of Jerusalem, which was in 586, before the Common Era, and after that exile in Babylon. So it's some of them may be written in exile or written after, but kind of commenting on that. There were a series of conquests by Alexander the Great, and then by these other groups, the Seleucids, who were a Greek-speaking monarchy, and the Ptolemies, which were an Egyptian but also Greek-speaking monarchy. Again, this is Hellenism. So after Alexander, a lot of people everywhere in the world are speaking Greek. The context for the Apocrypha is this Hellenistic culture, with Greek being the language, Greek being the culture, Greek being the kind of milieu in which these books are written. And as I mentioned, the Septuagint, which was this Greek translation of the Old Testament, is where these books find their home. They generally are stories of Jews living in exile and the Jews who were living in Palestine, back like in Jerusalem and around there, but under foreign domination. So these are stories about Jews who were living as strangers in a strange land. Even if that land was home, it was not under their control. And actually, the Maccabees is a story of a Jewish revolt and a brief window when there's another Jewish kingdom in Jerusalem. So, what about these books? Let's look at some of them in more detail. First, Esdras is actually a weird compendium. It's a summary of Second Chronicles, chapters 35 and 36, and a whole chunk of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So it's basically a retelling of or almost a quoting of what's already in the Bible. So I don't know if this was like a book that for people who didn't have a Bible, maybe these exiles were trying to cobble together like the scriptures they could find. But anyway, the chapters 3 to 5 in this book are new. The rest is all retelling of what was already in the Bible. First, Maccabees is a history of the Seleucid persecutions. We'll look at that in a little more detail in just a second. And this Maccabean revolt when Judas Maccabeus becomes king for a little while and drives out the hated Antiochus Epiphanes, this emperor who persecuted the Jews in Jerusalem. Second Maccabees is another version of that story, but this time really about the internal conflict between the Jews in Jerusalem who wanted to stay faithful to the old traditions of Judaism and the Jews in Jerusalem who are like, hey, this Hellenism stuff is pretty cool. Let's adopt some of the customs of the world around us. Let's modernize, basically. And this book is really about the conflict within Judaism over how much to accept the wider culture's influence. So who are the Maccabees? This was in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And as I mentioned, it related to the conquest by the Seleucids, who were a Greek-speaking monarchical family. Antiochus Epiphanes is written about by the Jewish historian Josephus in his book, The War of the Jews. And he writes, Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking of the city, Jerusalem, or with its pillage, or with the great slaughter he had made there, but being overcome with his violent passions and remembering what he had suffered during the siege, he compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country. And this was unusual. Most conquering emperors let people govern themselves as long as they paid taxes. They could kind of govern their own affairs, but he was ticked off and he was going to stick it to the Jews. So he dissolved their laws. He basically forbade them from circumcising their kids, which was a religious rite. And he sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple, which was the big insult that the Jews could not forgive. And the Jews, in fact, revolted against that. And many of them were put to death. So this was the pretense for the revolt of Judas Maccabeus. Some other historians have kind of thought about this in different ways. Many scholars actually argue that Antiochus was really trying to navigate an internal civil war. Remember, I said there was this conflict between the Jews who wanted to stay more Jewish and then the Jews who wanted to adopt more of the modern Hellenistic ideas. And so there's some debate about how much Antiochus Epiphanes was the bad guy. Josephus makes him out to be the bad guy, as does the book of Maccabees. He is really like the Darth Vader of the Old Testament because of, or the Apocrypha, because of his really the humiliation, religious humiliation of the people. That's kind of debate ongoing, but that's the context for the Maccabees. So that's first Maccabees, and then second Maccabees, as I said, is this internal struggle. Third Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha, Has nothing to do with the Maccabees. I don't know why it's titled that, but instead it's a novel, basically, a religious novel, a fiction, set in Egypt where the Jewish community was suffering. So maybe their idea was, remember how we suffered under Antiochus Epiphanes in Jerusalem? Well, hey, there was this other time we were suffering in Egypt for the Jews who were in the diaspora. Remember, the Jews had spread out everywhere. And so, according to this story, Ptolemy the Fourth, the pharaoh, was upset with the Jewish community. They were getting too numerous, just kind of like in the days of Joseph. And so he hatches a plot to exterminate the Jews by killing them by elephant. He he was going to get 500 elephants intoxicated, and then the elephants would trample the Jews to death, which is a really kind of elaborate and strange plot. Um, it's even funnier, the story. I mean, it's not funny. It's a tragic story of anti-Semitism, which is all too common, but there are some humorous elements. In this story, God sends angels who intervene. They cause Ptolemy to oversleep. So the day he's going to do this, he can't wake up. And then when he does wake up, God has caused him to forget that he was mad at the Jews. And then when the elephants get intoxicated, they turn on the Egyptian soldiers instead of the Jews. So God saves the people through this really remarkable turn of events. But yes, death by elephant is something I had never heard of before. And then fourth Maccabees is not a history at all, but it's really a Greek philosophical treatise that is exalting the idea of reason and wisdom. And so it's really part of that wisdom tradition that we see in some of the books of the Hebrew Bible, like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, etc., and also in some other of the apocryphal books. So the Maccabees are an interesting collection. And you could see why the church was struggling. Like, what do we do with these books? Like, one's a history, one's another version of the history, one is a novel, and another one is a philosophical treatise. Like, what even is this? How do we deal with these books? So the Apocrypha has been a puzzle for the church and for people of faith ever since the books were written, actually. But they're really people trying to wrestle with, how do we live as Jews in a strange land? How do we do it in under these persecutions of the Seleucids? How do we do it in Egypt when we're being persecuted by the Pharaoh? How do we live in this Greek culture? How do we maintain our traditions and our faith in the midst of a secular culture? So in many ways, they have a kind of modern feel to them, because some of the issues that these writers were facing are some of the same ones that we face today. Then there's some other fun ones. These are short historical novel. If you like historical novels, that's what these are. And we get the story of Judith, which is another wonderful story of a woman hero, a heroine, who saves her people from the enemies, a little bit like Esther did. We get what are called the diaspora novels. So these are novels that are sort of tacked on to the book of Daniel and are set in Babylon. There's the book of Tobit, which has some great folktale elements. One of the few stories in the Bible that has an angel as one of the main characters. Like, we meet Gabriel right when he announces to Mary that she's going to be pregnant in the New Testament. And there's a couple of angels that show up in the Old Testament, but this is Raphael, the archangel, with a major role in the story. There's a demon, and it's a kind of a great story. And then there's Bel and the Dragon, which is another great story, and Susanna. And these are stories that feature the prophet Daniel acting in a heroic way. So let's look at some of these in a little more detail. So Judith is the story of a Jewish widow who uses her beauty and charm, like Esther did, in this case, to kill an Assyrian general who has besieged her city. and is on his way to conquering Jerusalem. And so Judith, whose name means basically a woman Jew, it's connected to the name Judah. She is one of the great heroes of the Bible. We don't really know the original language that this book was written in. And it's a fascinating book because the surviving manuscripts in Greek seem to have some historical anachronisms. In other words, things that were in there that wouldn't have happened till much, much later, which is why a bunch of Protestant scholars think that this was not at all connected to a real event, that it was a fictional story. Catholic scholars have generally said, no, it is a historical story. It was real. And they say that the names were changed. So this actually was connected to the reign of King Manasseh in Judah, and referred to real events. So you make your own determination about that. It's hard to look back and know, but it's a great story at any rate, and always nice to see a woman hero in a Bible story. The Book of Tobit is another interesting fictional work. It's an apocryphal Jewish work. In other words, it's part of this group of books, probably written in the 3rd or 2nd century. And the themes are how God tests the faithful and responds to prayers and protects the Jews. And it tells the story of 2 families. There's Tobit, who is from Nineveh, and he is struck blind because of bird poop that blinds him. And his son, Tobias, is sent by Tobit on this epic journey. He has to go get 10 silver talents, which was a lot of money, that Tobit had once left in another city called Ragas in Media, which was near Persia. And so Tobias is guided by the archangel Raphael. Here's Raphael again. And he comes to the town of Ecbatana in Persia or in Media, where he meets Sarah. But Sarah, who's beautiful damsel in distress, is sort of watched over possessively by a demon named Asmodeus. And Asmodeus kills anybody who tries to come and marry Sarah because he wants her for himself. But Tobias has the aid of Raphael, the angel, and so they're able to defeat the demon, exorcise him, get rid of him, and then Tobias can get married to Sarah. They come home to Nineveh, and Tobit is cured of his blindness. So it's a kind of a great adventure story. And again, it's God protecting God's people in some very strange circumstances. And another book that is added on to the book of Daniel, this one is stuck on as chapter 13 of the book of Daniel, is the story of Susanna. And this is an interesting one too. Susanna is a Hebrew wife who is in her home bathing privately in this locked and walled garden. So she's in private and everything is decent. But 2 elders, we don't know in the story, I can't remember if they're Jews or not Jews, they spy her bathing. Now, how they did that, we don't know. And they both immediately fall in lust for Susanna. When she makes her way back to her house after being in this little area for bathing, they accost her, demanding that she have sexual intercourse with them. When she refuses, they arrest her, claiming that she is an adulteress. So, kind of a sad but typical story where the guys who are rebuffed then blame her. She refuses to be blackmailed. She's another tough broad in the Bible, and is arrested and is about to be put to death when our hero, Daniel, interrupts the proceedings, shouting that she needs a fair trial. And this is interesting too, because this comes up later in the New Testament. Daniel prevails upon people to follow the Jewish law, which was that there had to be 2 witnesses for someone to be convicted, and they had to agree on their statements. So in the story, the two guys, these two elders, these two old lechers, dirty old men, we might say, they're separated, and when they're interrogated, they mention different trees that she was near. And the fact that they got the trees wrong proves that they're lying. And so their suit fails. And I can't remember what happens to them. I should reread that story. But again, it's interesting because in the New Testament, when Jesus is arrested, they cannot find, if you remember, they cannot find two independent witnesses who will testify about Jesus' guilt. And so they pay off someone to falsely testify. And that's how Jesus is convicted and later crucified. So it's kind of interesting that in this, it's another example, a story of the Jewish law, in this case being used correctly to prevent a miscarriage of justice. And Daniel is brought in as the hero, even though it's, again, probably far from the actual story, the lifetime of Daniel. This is much later. Then there's another addition to the book of Daniel, Bel and the Dragon. Another great, these are a couple of different short stories. The first part is the story of Bel. Bel is an idol, and I think that in this medieval painting, I think that weird person in the left is supposed to be Bel, the idol. So Bel is this idol, and the Babylonian priests are putting out offerings, and Bel, this idol who's made of wood and whatever, is apparently eating these offerings. And Daniel goes, "This is bunk. This is an idol. This isn't a real God. This is," and so Daniel exposes the truth. He puts down, I think, wood shavings on the floor, sawdust, and so he proves that the priests of Bel and their family are sneaking in through a secret passage and eating the offerings to Bel. And Daniel again proves that our God is the only real God and that these idols are nothing but wood and stone. Now, it's risky because if Daniel didn't prove his point, he was going to be put to death, but he prevails. He's always the hero in these stories. And then the second half of chapter 14 is the story of the dragon, another idol. This is apparently a real dragon that's worshipped by the Babylonians. And Daniel proposes that he can slay the dragon without a sword. And he does so in the story by baking cakes made of pitch, tar, fat, and hair. In another case, it's made of nails, like roofing nails. And the dragon can't resist eating all this and then explodes. So once again, Daniel prevails against the idols of the Babylonians. These are marvelous stories, but you can get the sense they don't quite fit with a lot of the rest of the Bible. The next section of the Apocrypha are the wisdom books. Now, there are wisdom books in the Hebrew Bible as well. We mentioned Psalms and Proverbs and Job for a few, but these are some other ones, including the Wisdom of Solomon, which again, are words attributed to King Solomon, obviously written way after his time, and definitely very influenced by Greek philosophy and Greek literature. These chapters are written in Alexandria, most likely in Egypt, which was a center of the Greek-speaking diaspora. So a lot of Greek-speaking Jews had settled in Alexandria by the 1st century BCE, and that's likely where this book is written, a collection of wisdom sayings. And that's also true of the other book, The Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, which also gets named Ecclesiasticus. Now, it's really confusing because there is a book in the Hebrew Bible called Ecclesiastes, but this is Ecclesiasticus, and that's the wisdom of Sirach. It's also sometimes just called Sirach. And this book really feels like another version of the book of Proverbs. It's just lots of these great pithy one-liners that give wisdom. for how to live a good life. So the wisdom books generally are asking, what's the meaning of life? How do we live a good life? What's all this for anyway? Those kind of modern questions. They're a lot of fun to read. And I think we can get a lot of benefit from reading the wisdom books because they're great at getting us to think about those big questions in our lives as well. Finally, we have some more liturgical writings in the Apocrypha. These were hymns and psalms and prayers generally used probably in worship by people either in Jerusalem or in the diaspora. We have the prayer of Manasseh, which is attributed to King Manasseh of Judah, but again, way, way later, and has a lovely, really a beautifully written hymn, basically. It's a lament, and has got some great words in there. In our class on Thursday, I'll try to look up some to read. I'm sorry I didn't have that ready for this video. And then there's the prayer of Azariah and the song of the three young men, or the three Jews. This is another addition to the book of Daniel. So everybody loved the book of Daniel. And so when they wrote stuff, they just stuck it in there and added it on. So in the Septuagint, we get all these different sections to the book of Daniel. And this is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Azariah is another form of the word Abednego. And so these are the three young men who are thrown in the fiery furnace for their faithfulness to God by Nebuchadnezzar. And when he looks in to see if they're roasted yet, he sees there's an angelic figure there with them, the angel who is protecting them from the fire, and they emerge unscathed. Kind of like Daniel with the lion's den, a miraculous salvation for people who are faithful to God. And it is written in the style of the Psalms, and so it is used actually in worship to this day. We have it in our lectionary sometimes. The Song of the Three Young Men. It's a beautiful hymn of praise to God and thanks for being rescued. And finally, there's Psalm 151, which is a bonus psalm that is written about David slaying Goliath and is appended in the Greek Septuagint to the book of Psalms. So there's 150 official Psalms, and then 151 is this bonus psalm. And then we've got a couple other bits and pieces. The letter of Jeremiah. It's interesting. There are no other letters in the Hebrew Bible. Think about that. There's a bunch in the New Testament, none in the Hebrew Bible. This letter was written in that Hellenistic period of Greek culture, and probably influenced St. Paul and John and the other letter writers, because it's like a proto-letter that maybe they thought, hey, that's a good way to communicate the truth of the gospel. And then Second Esdras, which is, you remember in that chart I showed you, almost nobody included in their Bibles. It's apocalyptic, it's kind of freaky. There's metaphoric language, symbolic numbers, angelic messengers. It's if you're into like numerology and conspiracy stuff, if you really love Revelation, you're going to love Second Esdras. The early church wasn't so sure about it, but that is also part of this apocalyptic and apocryphal literature that we see in this section. And that's it. That's the Apocrypha. It is a fascinating collection of books, worth reading, but also worth kind of questioning. How does it fit? What does it mean? How do we read these books? There's a lot for inspiration. I kind of like, I got to say, the approach that the Church of England took in the 39 articles, that these were useful for instruction and maybe inspiration. But you could tell they were like, but there's like an asterisk. Not so sure that these are authoritative in the same way that the rest of the Bible is. Well, I welcome your questions and thoughts about the Apocrypha, and be happy to answer them. Email me at ericw@stpfeeds.org. And in the meantime, have a wonderful season after Epiphany and blessed day. And thanks for joining me for this tour of the Apocrypha.